first hard numbers are now beginning to tell their own story about what this war with Iran is costing the United States, and those numbers keep moving in the wrong direction. The U.S. military has confirmed that 399 American troops have been wounded since the start of the Iran war, a sharp increase from earlier disclosures, and a reminder that even when the headlines focus on missiles, maps, and meetings, the human toll keeps accumulating in the background. A U.S. Central Command spokesman, Captain Tim Hawkins, put it bluntly. He said 3 of those injuries are classified as serious. 2 weeks earlier, the military had reported 348 wounded, including 6 listed as serious. Officials have not publicly explained whether some of those earlier serious cases improved, were reclassified, or were reported differently as updated reports came in. Of the 399 wounded, the military says 354 have already returned to duty, a figure often pointed to as evidence of recovery and resilience, but also one that underlines just how many service members have been pushed through the cycle of combat, injury, treatment, and return. The U.S. fatality count in the operation stands at 13. And yet, for all of those numbers, the Pentagon has released few additional details about how or where many of the injuries occurred. That lack of specificity leaves an unavoidable gap in public understanding, not just about the conditions U.S. forces are facing, but about what kinds of missions are producing the casualties and whether the risks are changing as the war evolves. What is becoming clearer day by day is that this conflict is not confined to airstrikes or to a single front. It is now colliding head-on with one of the world's most sensitive economic choke points, the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. has begun enforcing what it describes as a military blockade on Iranian ports, a pressure campaign designed to choke off Iran's ability to export and to restrict maritime traffic connected to Iranian trade. But in the first days of enforcement, ship tracking data and public reporting have raised uncomfortable questions about how cleanly such a blockade can be applied in practice, especially in crowded waters where ships can reroute, disguise ownership, or exploit ambiguity in real time. Maritime tracking platforms indicated that ships linked to Iran were still able to pass through the Strait of Hormuz even after the new restrictions were said to be in force. According to maritime intelligence and tracking data cited by multiple outlets, at least 2 vessels crossed the strait after the blockade began. One of them was a bulk carrier named Christiana, reported to have unloaded cargo at Iran's Bandar Imam Khomeini port before being tracked moving past Larak Island in the strait after the blockade start time. Another vessel, the tanker Elpis, also reportedly followed a similar path, clearing the strait within hours without any publicly reported interception. Then came an additional wrinkle. Tracking data and reporting also pointed to a tanker linked to China, the Rich Starry, moving through the same corridor. According to those reports, the ship initially appeared to turn back as the blockade was announced, only to later resume its transit and successfully cross into the Gulf of Oman. Some reporting said it broadcast that it carried a Chinese crew as it moved. That detail matters because it hints at how quickly a maritime pressure campaign can become tangled up in global politics. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a regional waterway, it is a global artery. And once major commercial players or vessels tied to major powers are involved, enforcement becomes less a matter of simple interdiction and more a test of escalation control. Iran's initial reaction, at least publicly, was not to claim a direct military clash in the strait, but to sharpen its messaging. An Iranian embassy's social media account mocked the episode, portraying the situation as a humiliating workaround rather than a show of U.S. control. That kind of messaging is not just sarcasm, it is strategy. It aims to plant a simple idea in the global conversation that the U.S. can announce sweeping restrictions, but it cannot fully command events once ships are moving, once flags are flying, and once global commerce is at stake. At the same time, the United States is expanding its military footprint around the very waters it is trying to police. Satellite imagery and open-source tracking have pointed to the presence of a U.S. aircraft carrier operating near Iran, positioned in a way that signals both capability and caution. Reporting based on satellite images described the US Abraham Lincoln as being roughly 200 kilometers south of Iran's coast in the Gulf of Oman, near enough to project force toward the strait, but positioned in deeper, more open waters rather than inside the narrow confines of Hormuz itself. That placement reflects a broader tactical logic. The U.S. can try to pressure shipping flows before vessels reach the choke point, creating a kind of outer ring of interdiction. In theory, operating from the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea gives U.S. forces more room to maneuver, more reaction time, and less vulnerability to coastal threats that are harder to counter in the tight lanes of Hormuz. A carrier strike group brings more than fighter jets. It adds persistent surveillance, electronic warfare, command and control capacity, and rapid strike options, all of which matter when the objective is not just to fight, but to control a moving, adaptive environment where the targets may be commercial ships, shadow fleet tankers, or vessels that sit in a gray zone between legitimate commerce and sanctioned trade. But even as U.S. assets reposition, Iran is framing the entire approach as economically reckless and potentially self-defeating. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Esmail Baghaei, criticized what he described as the underlying logic of the U.S. strategy. In a message posted publicly, he cast doubt on the idea that an illegal war of choice could be won through economic coercion aimed at the broader world. He said, can an illegal war of choice be won through an electoral revenge against the global economy? The phrasing is pointed. It is designed for international ears, for countries that may not be aligned with Iran, but that do depend on stable shipping and stable energy prices. The message is, even if you do not care about Iran, you will care about what happens to your supply chains, your insurance rates, and your fuel costs if this escalates. And in fact, markets have already been watching. Oil prices have shown sensitivity to any signal that tanker traffic could be disrupted or that insurers could start pulling back from routes perceived as too risky. That is part of what makes the early ship tracking reports so important. If multiple sanctioned or Iran-linked vessels can still transit, it suggests either uneven enforcement, evolving rules of engagement, or a U.S. effort to avoid direct confrontation with commercial shipping unless absolutely necessary. Any of those possibilities would shape how shipping companies, traders, and foreign governments respond. In the background, the war's tempo on the military side has also appeared to shift again, driven in part by diplomacy that failed to hold. High-stakes talks between the United States and Iran and Islamabad collapsed without producing an agreement, and the collapse has been followed by fresh signals of reinforcement and readiness. Reporting in the days following the failed talks described the Pentagon accelerating deployments into the region, including additional troops and aircraft positioned for rapid response. Some reports have suggested that nearly 1,000 additional troops were deployed alongside attacked aircraft and that thousands more, including paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, were being positioned in ways that suggest planners want ground options available, even if the public emphasis remains on air and maritime pressure. The U.S. has also made clear that the blockade, as described by Central Command, is intended to target Iranian ports while not halting traffic for other countries transiting the Strait of Hormuz. That distinction is crucial on paper, but more complicated in practice, especially when vessels may change declared destinations, operate through intermediaries, or move within networks designed to obscure ties to sanctioned trade. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf has also signaled that Tehran sees the economic dimension as a battlefield and that it is prepared to threaten what it views as financial enablers of the U.S. posture. Meanwhile, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has issued its own warnings, emphasizing that military vessels approaching the strait risk confrontation. The message is that Iran reserves the right to respond and that even if it does not seek a direct naval battle, it can raise the cost and uncertainty for any force operating near its shores. Against that backdrop, another set of images and reports has been feeding the sense that the region is bracing for a bigger phase. The U.S. Navy has released photographs showing sailors preparing aircraft for nighttime combat operations in the Central Command area of responsibility, a visual reminder that the war is not paused, even when diplomacy briefly surfaces. And there have been reports of refueling aircraft positioned at Israel's Ben Gurion Airport, with tanker assets viewed as especially significant because they extend the reach and endurance of strike aircraft. Aerial refueling is not a background detail in this kind of war. It is an enabling capability that can determine how frequently aircraft can sortie, how long they can loiter, and how far they can travel with meaningful payloads. All of it contributes to the same building question: is this a show of force designed to compel a political outcome, or is it preparation for a new escalation that could widen the conflict? President Donald Trump has argued the pressure campaign is working, while also delivering threats that have reverberated far beyond Washington. After the Islamabad talks failed, Trump announced a naval blockade and framed it as a decisive move. In social media posts and public remarks around the blockade's launch, he depicted U.S. power as overwhelming, language that supporters see as deterrence and critics see as provocation. At the same time, reporting has indicated that Trump has been weighing military options that range from limited renewed strikes to a broader bombing campaign, though accounts have also suggested that a full-scale, open-ended expansion is viewed as less likely because of the risk of destabilizing the region further and the political cost of getting pulled into a prolonged conflict. The problem is that war does not always follow a single decision point. It can expand through friction, through a misread radio call at sea, a drone that flies too close, an interception that turns into an exchange, or a strike that hits the wrong target and demands retaliation. And the early days of the blockade already show how quickly friction can appear. If a blockade is declared, but multiple vessels still transit, whether due to enforcement choices, confusion, or calculated defiance, then every subsequent transit becomes a test. Each ship becomes a question. Will it be stopped, warned, turned back, boarded, seized, or allowed to pass? And every time a ship is allowed through, another question follows. Is the blockade a hard barrier or a selective pressure tool? For the U.S. military, the objective may be to squeeze Iran while avoiding direct confrontation with global commerce. For Iran, the objective may be to prove it cannot be isolated and that attempts to do so will carry costs that spread outward. Meanwhile, the casualty numbers continue to climb and the war's footprint continues to widen. The U.S. says hundreds have been wounded. Most have returned to duty and 13 have been killed. Iran warns that pressure on shipping will ricochet into the world economy. International shipping data suggests ships are testing and sometimes slipping through newly announced restrictions. A U.S. carrier operates close enough to threaten action, but far enough to avoid the most dangerous narrow waters. Diplomacy has broken down and reinforcements have flowed in. None of this looks like an end game. It looks like a conflict settling into a dangerous rhythm, one where military power, economic pressure, political messaging, and global trade all collide in the same small stretch of water, and where the margin for error is shrinking by the day. And as the numbers begin to tell their own story, they may be telling something else, too, that even if leaders talk about limited moves, the machinery of escalation has a way of pulling events towards something far bigger than originally planned.